Welcome to another edition of the Thursday Night Bible Study. Notice just went out. We're going to give it a couple of minutes for people to get on, and those that like to get on and join us live. And those of you that like to watch in an archive, thank you. I hope you really enjoyed uh, this teaching on wisdom. And so a lot of people have, and a lot of people have been watching the videos, and I so appreciate all your support. And there's Katrina, Denise, welcome. Folks are starting to come on live, and so uh, things are moving amazingly, in our world today, and they did in the time of all of the time of the Bible. It's amazing. Well, Catherine, glad that you joined us. Thank you. Jane, Michelle, welcome. Yeah, I missed you yesterday too. We had a good, but you can look on Teams and find it there. We recorded it for you. All right. And Kathy, hello. So I have another Bible study. What I'm referring to is I have another Bible study at work that I've done for the last 10 years or more, 11 years maybe. And that's what I was talking to Michelle about. Now, the nice thing about Facebook is that all the videos are recorded. There are 45, 46 videos, I think, somewhere along in there, on the seed page, and then if you go on the page and don't know this might help you. There's a box off to the side that says popular topics, or if it's on your phone, it may be down a little bit if you watch on your phone. And one of the topics there is Lanny's teachings. And so I tag all the videos under Lanny's teachings. And if you hit that button, it brings all of the teachings to the top of your Facebook feed. And that way you don't have to go looking for them. And they'll just line up right down the line, and you can choose what you want to listen to, and I appreciate that you do that. Hello, Robert. Lynn, hello. And John should be on any minute. He sent me a note saying he would definitely be here. So, but I appreciate all your support, everybody that comes on live or watches in an archive, and thank you. Thank you. Now, I will ask that you share, if you like the videos, that you share them on your Facebook page. Take a moment, share the video, and let it get out to people that I could not possibly teach to, or could not possibly reach. So, all right. And so many times there are so many things in the Bible that we talk about, and so many times preachers just don't have time to do it. They don't have time to go through it like we do on a Bible study like this. So there's John. He's here. Okay. And let's see, what time is it? 7:02. Let's give it about another minute in case there's some other people that would like to join us. Now, if you happen to have a Catholic Bible, the Catholic Bible has 7 books in it that the Protestant Bible does not, and one of them is the Wisdom of Solomon, and that's what I've been teaching out of. So if you happen to have that, you can turn to Wisdom chapter 16. I was going to start at verse 20, but I think it'd probably be better to slip back up to verse 15 and kind of ease into it, okay? And Nancy, hello. And Mary, how are you? Good evening. All right, shall we begin? Let's have a word of prayer first. Father, we thank you. We praise you. Thank you for allowing us all to get together. I thank you for all those that also will watch this at an archive. I thank you, Father, that you open our hearts and minds to your word. You open our eyes to the word and help us to see things that we've never seen before. And I bless you and we thank you. Take your liberty, teach us your word, and we thank you in Jesus' name. Amen. Okay, this particular section, if you're not familiar with the Wisdom of Solomon, it has different sections. This particular section within chapter 16 is called "Disastrous Storms Strike Egypt," and he was saying here in verse 15, he says, and keep in mind, it's Solomon that's giving out all of this wisdom and telling us how all this works. He said to escape from your hand is impossible. Talking about escape from God's hand is impossible. And somebody's trying to call me. And hang on a second while I turn my ringer off. Sorry about that. So he says to escape from your hand is impossible for the ungodly refusing to know you. And that's a key thing. God has made his name. He has made himself. He has made himself so well known. He says, all you have to do is look at nature, and you can see my qualities everywhere. But he says here, the ungodly refuse to know him. And he said, for the ungodly refusing to know you were flogged by the strength of your arm, pursued by unusual rains and hail and relentless storms, and utterly consumed by fire. For most incredible of all, the water, which quenches all things, the fire had still greater effect. So what he was saying is that there are a lot of times when nature works along with God, and he tells fire, for instance, don't burn. Or he tells water, don't quench the fire. And so he says, for the universe defends the righteous. That makes all the difference. And that particular understanding, Solomon is trying to get that point across to us. Okay? So let's go on. He said, at one time the flame was restrained, so that it might not consume the creatures sent against the ungodly, but that seeing this, they might know that they were being pursued by the judgment of God. And at another time, even in the midst of water, it burned more intensely than fire, to destroy the crops of the unrighteous land. And so he's saying that by nature itself, and when people see that nature is not acting the way it normally acts, then that's another way that God shows us his power and helps people who don't know him to understand that God actually is real. The biggest problem with people who don't believe in God is they've never had an encounter with God. And I would guarantee that most of the church also, those who, even believers, most of the folks have never had an encounter with God. And other than getting saved, they've never had anything happen to them where they could say, this I know is God, and God trying to get a hold of that particular person. God wants us to know that he is actually real. So many times when we're praying for people, there are events that take place, and they're unexplainable events in the natural realm. But then when you start to consider the supernatural realm, and you start considering and factoring in demonic spirits and angels, and then things are more easily explained that way when you realize that there's another group behind the curtain, if you will, in the spirit realm that is doing a lot of stuff that that we could not possibly do or could not possibly explain. So he goes on here, he says in verse 20, he said, instead of these things, you gave your people food of angels. And without their toil, you supplied them from heaven with bread ready to eat, providing, now, well, let me back up here. Okay, first of all, what's he talking about? He's talking about Exodus 16. This is where the Israelites were going through the desert, and they had escaped Egypt and were going through the desert, and they were talking about how they didn't have enough food. They were reminiscing about the food that they had to eat in Egypt and that sort of thing. And so God gave them manna, and that's what he's talking about. You gave your people food of angels. Okay? Now we really don't know a whole lot about manna as far as that goes, but Solomon here gives us a little more understanding of what that was like. Okay? So he says here, he says that instead of these things, instead of the punishment that the ungodly were getting, he said essentially you made a difference between your people and the ungodly people, and normal things and normal disasters had hit the ungodly people. He said, but for your people, the Israelites, he said you gave them the food of angels. And without their toil, you supplied them from heaven with bread ready to eat. Now, he's in the normal course of things, okay? In the normal course of things that, we have farmers all over the world that plant food on a regular basis, and it's kind of amusing sometimes to ask a little kid, well, where does this come from? Or where does that come from? And they'll say, Kroger's, or Walmart, but that's only the place where you pick it up and buy it. But there's a farmer someplace who has done all the work, who has raised the crops, who have raised the livestock, whatever it happens to be. But he said here they were going through the desert and God supplied them food, and without their toil, because generally there is never a harvest without some sort of work, without a lot of work. He says, look, you made a difference in your people. You didn't make them work for it. Without their toil, without their putting in their work, to where they couldn't say, oh, well, by my hand I did this and I did that. No. The only reason that works to plant seeds and gain a harvest is because that's the way God set things up. Well, here he's changing things a little different. And he says, look, without their toil, you supplied them from heaven with bread ready to eat. Now catch this. Providing every pleasure and suited to every taste. Well, have you ever heard that one before? No. So the manna was like little round wafers, okay? Nobody really has a picture of them, but from what we understand, they're round wafers, and Solomon says they provide every pleasure and were suited to every taste. So how many times, when you go to a restaurant, everybody doesn't get the same thing because everybody's tastes are different. Well, the same thing with the Israelites. You've got 3 million people out there in the desert, and they have a wide variety of tastes. And he said this manna suited every taste. That alone is a tremendous miracle that that our Bible never tells us about. We had no idea. And so he goes on, and he says that for your sustenance manifested your sweetness toward your children. He said he was trying to get across to them that he had sustained them with this manna, and this manna was, the sweetness of the manna was to show them the sweetness God had towards them, his children. Okay? And he said, for your sustenance manifested your sweetness toward your children, and the bread ministering to the desire of the one who took it was changed to suit everyone's liking. Wow. Now, I had never heard that before. And our regular Bible does not, the Protestant Bible does not mention that at all. We had no idea that the manna, when they went to collect it and they would eat it, what would happen is every morning it would suddenly appear. Okay? And they were instructed to go out and collect it every morning but they were only to collect enough that would last them for that day. They were not to collect more than what they needed for one day's food. And of course, the Israelites, a lot of them didn't listen, and there were still, some out there, still plenty out there. So instead of going out every day, they collected 2 days worth or 3 days worth. And then they got up that second morning thinking, okay, I don't have to go out there again, and found that the manna they had collected was completely spoiled and full of worms. God told them, I have told this manna, I have instructed this manna to last one day. And that's it. One day. So he told them, he says, don't get greedy. Go out and you pick up enough that will satisfy you and your family for one day. Then the next day, you do it again. But then when Saturday comes, or I should say the Sabbath, they didn't have Saturday. The Sabbath started at 6 o'clock on Friday night and went to 6 o'clock on Saturday. And so before the Sabbath started, then that morning they could pick up enough for 2 days, because he told them you're not to go out and collect the manna on the Sabbath. So they would collect enough for 2 days. And that one day of the week, the manna would not rot that second day. If they picked up 2 days worth of manna any other time during the week, they would wake up that second day and the manna would be spoiled. But the day before the day before the Sabbath, they would pick up 2 days worth, okay, and that next morning it would still be good. The second morning would still be good, and then they would go on. And so the different things, like kids oftentimes want something totally different than the parents do for breakfast and or lunch or whatever. And so this manna literally changed to suit everyone's liking. There's no food that I know of that absolutely everybody likes. Except this. This was totally different. And this was God showing his people. He goes on and he says, snow and ice withstood fire without melting, so that they might know that the crops of their enemies were being destroyed by the fire that blazed in the hail and flashed in the showers of rain, whereas the fire, in order that the righteous might be fed, even forgot its native power. This all happened in to Moses in Exodus 3. Okay, so here's what he's saying. In Exodus 3, he says, now Moses kept the flock of Jethro, his father-in-law, the priest of Midian. Okay, what are we looking for here? Where it says that the fire forgot its native power. Okay, and so he says Moses kept the flock of Jethro, his father-in-law, the priest of Midian, and he led the flock to the back or west side of the wilderness and came to Horeb or Sinai, the mountain of God. The angel of the Lord appeared to him in a flame of fire out of the midst of a bush. Now, what does a flame do when it comes in contact with a bush? It consumes it. It burns it up. It'll reduce it to ashes. But here he looked, and behold, the bush burned with fire, yet was not consumed. Why? Because God told it not to consume. And that's what wisdom was talking about. He said, even to the point that the fire forgot its native power. Its native power is to destroy, to cleanse, to produce heat and light and that sort of thing. And so what he was saying here is that Moses was going about his job taking care of the sheep, and he happens to look up and he sees this bush on fire, but the first thing he noticed is it's not being consumed. And he thought, wow, I have got to turn aside and see this great sight, why the bush is not burned. what wisdom is talking about here, he says in Wisdom 16:24, he says, "For creation, serving you who made it, exerts itself to punish the unrighteous, and in kindness relaxes on behalf of those who trust in you." And he said creation literally works with God hand in hand, and that there are times when God tells creation, "I want you to calm down." And this burning bush, God told that fire, "Don't consume it." So here it is, it's burning and burning and burning, nothing's being consumed. And that led Moses to go up, and that's where he met God. That's where he had his encounter that literally changed his life forever. And so he also says here in verse 24 that when it comes to God makes a difference between his people and the unrighteous people. And so he tells nature to relax on behalf of those who trust in God. But then it can do what it usually does when it comes to the unrighteous. And so and he says, therefore, at that time also, changed into all forms, it served your all-nourishing bounty. Okay, here again, he's talking about manna, and he says it changed, and it literally became the all-nourishing bounty that the Israelites needed. And he said, also according to the desire of those who had need, so that your children whom you loved, O Lord, might learn that it is not the production of crops that feeds humankind. Well, he says it's not the production of crops that feeds humankind. He says, but that your word sustains those who trust in you. Now that brings up an interesting verse. He was saying, because our norm is to plant the crops and harvest the crops. Plant the crops, harvest the crops. Put the work in and you get the harvest. He said what he was trying to teach his children is that production of crops like that, it's not the production of crops that feeds the humankind, but it's your word that sustains those who trust in you. And for instance, okay, give you another example. In the New Testament, the little boy that there were somewhere along the line of 20 to 50,000 people sitting out there listening to Jesus teach all day, and the disciples came and said, Master, the people have been here for a couple of days now. You should send them away and let them go to the towns round about and get something to eat. He looks at them and says, you give them something to eat. And they're like, where in the world would we get so much food to feed all of these people? And they kind of went off and came back and said, all we found is this little boy's lunch. That's all they had. And Jesus took the lunch. He said, give it to me. And they did. He says, have the people sit down in groups of 50. And they went throughout the group and told them to, huddle up in groups of 50 so that they could walk in between. I accidentally hit my microphone there and turned it off for a second. So he told them, he said to have the people sit down in groups of 50, and then he thanked God for the food, thanked God that he had provided the food, and he started breaking it and giving it out to the disciples. And the disciples then would, from what I understand, would take it then, and as they were giving it out, God kept supplying. It just kept going and going and going. So this little boy's lunch of 5 loaves and 2 fish, okay, wound up feeding all the people. Like I say, depending on how you count it, between 20 and 50,000 people. Some people only counted the men. Some people counted the men, the women, and the children. And so, but however you look at it, It was a tremendous miracle. And then, keeping in mind what they started with was a little boy's lunch of 5 loaves and 2 fish. And Jesus told them, go pick up the remnants. They went to pick up the remnants and found that they had 12 baskets, large baskets of leftovers. Isn't that amazing? They started out with one small lunch basket, fed all of these people. Why? Because nature was working along with God, and God said, multiply. So it just kept multiplying and multiplying and multiplying. And at the end, 12 large baskets were left over. It's amazing. Back in the Old Testament, there was Elijah. They were clearing out some trees and brush and stuff like that. And one of the men had borrowed an axe, and he was using it, to get rid of some of this brush and stuff like that. And all of a sudden, the axe head came off and fell into the water, and they couldn't find it. And he went to the prophet and said, what am I going to do? I need to, to return this back, and I have no way of returning this axe head. It was a valuable piece of equipment at that time. So he went over and stretched out his hand over the water, and the axe head literally floated to the top. And that way they could find it, pick it up, and he gave it back to the man. And there are things all over the Word of God like that. And so he goes on here, and he says that in Wisdom 16, he says, 20 in verse 27, he says, for what was not destroyed by fire was melted when simply warmed by a fleeting ray of the sun, to make it known that one must rise early before the sun to give you thanks. So, for instance, when getting back to the manna, if people didn't get up before the sun came up, then they decided to wait till later. The manna would melt away. And so they had to make sure they were up early to go out and collect the manna. Once they collected it, it was fine. But if they waited too long, slept in too long, then they would go out and find that it wasn't there, and they wouldn't have anything to eat that day. He says that he did that to make it known that one must rise before the sun to give you thanks. I have never heard that before either. And I've heard preachers say that you need to get up at 3 o'clock in the morning or so, and it's like, no. But here he's saying that God did this so they would understand that you need to get up before the sun rises to give God thanks, and must pray to you at the dawning of the light. How interesting is that? He says, here's another thing. He says, for the hope of an ungrateful person will melt like wintry frost and flow away like wastewater. A person who is ungrateful. When God talks about tithes and offerings, he said God loves a cheerful giver, because God has set certain blessings on the tithes and offerings. Someone asked me here a while back, what do you have to say to a person who doesn't, participate in tithes and offerings? I said, they're an idiot. The blessing that God gives you from that is way too much to take a chance on not getting. And isn't that amazing? So he says the hope of an ungrateful person will melt away like wintry frost and flow away like wastewater. Wow. So then he goes on, and he goes and talks about, he literally backs up to the Egyptians, because we were just talking about them, the Israelites going through the desert. Now he's backing up to where Israel was still in Egypt. And all of this is prophesied in Genesis 15:13. Okay? He says, and God said to Abram, know positively that your descendants will be strangers dwelling as temporary residents in a land that is not theirs. Okay? That would be Egypt. And they will be slaves there and will be afflicted and oppressed for 400 years. That was fulfilled in Exodus 12. And 400 years. Now, keep it in mind here, God told him in Exodus 10, or Genesis 15, that was going to happen. And by Exodus 12, that was 400 years later. And he says, and I will bring judgment on that nation whom they will serve, and afterward they will come out with great possessions. So that's what he told them. Okay? And, we've had a lot more people join us here. Patsy, Doris, welcome. And Denise, Michelle, yeah. That was new info on the manna. Yeah, it was. I'd never heard that before either. And it'd be like kale tasting like pizza or cheesecake, Michelle says. That's right. That's true. Where it was different for every person. And Patsy said, please disregard the angry emoji. I accidentally bumped it. All right. And Carrie, good to see you. You just got home? All right, good. Good. Well, thank you for joining us. And so he says here, he says that he told Abraham that that Israel would go into Egypt and they would be afflicted and oppressed for 400 years. Now, at first, that wasn't the case. They were welcomed in because of Joseph. Joseph had just saved all of Egypt from plagues that had been that would be going on for years. No, well, plagues. What am I trying to say? Droughts, and they would have tremendous drought, and the crops wouldn't grow, and they would have 7 years of plenty and then 7 years of drought. God showed that to Joseph, and God took what Joseph's brothers meant for terrible, went for evil, and turned it around to their good. And he told Joseph this ahead of time in the dreams that he was having. He didn't know exactly how that was all going to work out, but he knew at some point God showed him that your brothers, your mother, your dad will all bow down to you. And when he shared his dream with his brothers, they were seething mad. They could not see straight. They were so mad. And they didn't want to kill him outright, so they sold him into slavery. So this is what they meant for evil, God meant for good and turned the whole thing around. But then later, Joseph became the prime minister of Egypt. Saved all of Egypt from the drought, the famine that was going on, and then a new Pharaoh comes on, and the Pharaoh changes hands. So the children of Israel were welcomed joyously at first, but then after time went on, things started to slowly but surely change, and then they wound up actually changing so much that they were slaves. And God told Abram that they would be afflicted and oppressed for 400 years, and they were. Okay, so here Solomon is talking about the terror strikes the Egyptians at night. This is his heading, and in verse 17 he says, "Great are your judgments and hard to describe. Therefore, uninstructed souls have gone astray. For when lawless people supposed that they held the holy nation in their power," talking about Egypt, he says they would be the lawless people. Why did he call them lawless people? Because they didn't have the law of God. And they were idol worshippers. They had like 2,000 idols, 2,000 gods that they worshipped on a regular basis. And he says this lawless people supposed that they held the holy nation, which is Israel, in their power. He says, but they themselves lay as captives of darkness and prisoners of long night, shut in under their roofs, exiles from eternal providence. He said, eternal providence. They were total exiles from that. They had no possible way of getting into a righteous state with God, is what he's talking about. And so he says here, they thought that they had Israel held captive. He said, but actually they themselves were captives of darkness. How many times do we have you heard stories where people are literally captive in the darkness or the sins or whatever it is that they are oppressed with on a regular basis? Okay? If you look at a person that's on drugs, for instance, or alcohol, as an example, what started out as a fun time actually became imprisonment. And they were held captive by those drugs or alcohol because they were addictive. And so here he says that Egypt thought they had the holy nation captive. They had him in their power when they didn't realize that they themselves were captives of darkness and prisoners of the long night and total exiles from eternal providence. He says, for thinking that their secret sins, this is verse 3, for thinking that their secret sins, they were unobserved behind a dark curtain of forgetfulness. They were scattered, terribly alarmed, and appalled by specters. He says what's the secret sins he was talking about? He's talking about the idolatry. He's talking about the magical arts that they practiced. And he says, for thinking that in their secret sins, they were unobserved. God, so much of the time, he is so patient that people don't realize, they don't think of God as seeing all the things that they're into. But you got to keep in mind, God is omnipresent. He is everywhere at the same time. And so the Bible talks about how the heaven is his throne and the earth is a footstool for him. And so he is everywhere at the same time, and he sees all the things that was going on. And he had already told Abram 400 years they were going to go through this. Okay, and he says, but the Egyptians, they were scattered, terribly alarmed, and appalled by specters. Okay, what's a specter? We would call them spirits. Okay. Specters could be demonic spirits. Specters could be what we might term as ghosts. Some people don't, they look at something like that and they think, well, those were ghosts, that suddenly haunted these people. Why? Because they could. Because you got to keep in mind now, the way sin works is sin shrieks in the spirit realm. Okay, we learned that when the angels came, when God came to talk to Abram about Sodom and Gomorrah. He says, I've come to see if the shrieking of the sins is as bad as what I'm hearing. And then we know what happened with Sodom and Gomorrah and all the 12 different cities around them that were completely destroyed. And so he was saying that these people, even though they were the Egyptians, even though they were supposedly the masters, they didn't realize what all they were slaves to. Okay? He says, for not even the inner chamber that held them protected them from fear. Well, that's true. Any place you go, a person who is subject to fear, if Satan can use fear against you, that he said that's what happened with these people. They were always afraid. And that fear, there was nowhere to escape from it. They were constantly in fear. And of course, this is something new as well. We've never, never heard about that from the Protestant Bible. He says, "But terrifying sounds rang out around them, and dismal phantoms with gloomy faces appeared." And he says, "No power of fire was able to give light, nor did the brilliant flames of the stars avail to illume that hateful night." What's he talking about? He's talking about one of the plagues was absolute darkness. Absolute darkness. Okay? And he said that no matter what, they started fires, but it didn't give them any light. The stars, when it came nighttime, no light, and he said it was to no avail. That particular, it's amazing. Okay, well, let me stop there. We're going to learn a couple of other things here. I'm kind of getting ahead of myself. And so he says nothing was shining through to them. Nothing was shining through to them, except a dreadful self-kindled fire. Worry and fear and dread brought on by speculation because they couldn't see. He says nothing was shining through to them. It's like God just turned their eyes off. Now, we've always been taught that the darkness fell all over Egypt, but we never really knew how. It's almost like the God told the sun not to shine, but we know that wasn't the case, because in the land of Goshen, which was the main area where the Israelites stayed, it was light as normal. But they said there was like a line in the sand, a line in the ground, and on one side of the line you could see just fine. On the other side of the line, couldn't see at all. Now here, Solomon is saying that nothing was shining through to them. They couldn't see the light. And he said just that self-kindled fire that and terror, they deemed the things that they saw to be worse than than that unseen appearance. So they're hearing things, okay? They're hearing things and they can't see what's going on. They're blind. And it's, so they were imagining all these different things. They'd hear a noise here, a sound there, and fear, this dread and fear and worry was all over them, and it just blew it all out of proportion. Okay, that's what he's talking about here. And he says that alone was worse than the unseen appearance. And he says, now, the delusions of their magic arts lay humbled, and their boasted wisdom was scornfully rebuked. Keeping in mind that each of the 12 plagues of Egypt coincided with one of the major gods that Egypt worshipped. God was saying, okay, you think gnats, the frogs, all the various things all the various plagues that hit them were directly related to one of the idols that Egypt worshipped. Okay, and God was telling them, "Oh, you think your idol is so bad here? Let me show you what I can do." And it was astounding. And so well, let's go on. He says that the delusions of their magic art lay humbled. What's he talking about there? He's talking about when Moses and Aaron first came up to Pharaoh. God told him, he says, when you get there, take your walking stick with you and throw it down. And he did, and it became a snake. And the Pharaoh called for his magicians, and they did the same thing. And for the first 2 or 3 of the plagues, Moses would announce what God was doing, and God would do it. and then these magical arts, they would match it. And what he's saying is that that it would escalate for the next one, and then the next one, then the next one, and the magical arts lay humbled. They couldn't keep up with what God was doing. And he said, all their boasted wisdom was scornfully rebuked. They had no clue what was going on. It was devastating for them. And he says, for those who promised to drive off the fears and disorders of a sick soul, were sick themselves with ridiculous fear. So they had people, when people got into these panic states and had fear and panic and terror, they would call for a physician who would come in and he would help them with it. Okay, just same thing we do today. If someone has panic attacks or something like that, then we'll call a doctor and have, see what they can do about medicating that person and helping them through that. He said, but those who promised to drive off those fears, those that you would normally call to come handle a situation like that, were also themselves sick with ridiculous fear. It gripped them so strong, even they couldn't move. And he said, for even if nothing disturbing frightened them, yet scared by the passing of wild animals and the hissing of snakes, they perished in trembling fear, refusing to look even at the air, though it nowhere could be avoided. And he said everything, even when nothing was going on that would normally terrify them, any little sound would cause them, they were so steeped in fear at this point that every little sound was terrifying to them. He said, for wickedness is a cowardly thing, condemned by its own testimony. Distressed by conscience, it has always exaggerated the difficulties. Okay? Same thing with worry. Worry does the same thing. Worry is simply fearing something that you expect to happen, but it hasn't. And most of the time, things that you worry about never do happen. And that fear, though, and that's what he's saying, for fear is nothing but a giving up of the helps that come from reason, and hope defeated by its inward weakness. He's like, wow, fear is nothing but a giving up of the helps that come from reason. A normal reasoning person, when they're not gripped in this fear, would think, okay, oh, that was just an animal. That was this. That was that. It's like, okay, we're okay. Nothing's wrong. And he said, but that fear wipes away what reason would normally have come up and helped them with. He said, and hope defeated by this inward weakness. So they feel like they have no hope. This fear is overpowering, and now they have no hope. And he says it prefers ignorance of what causes the torment. They just don't know why. You know, when a person is in a state of panic or fear, you really can't talk to them about what's going on, because they're so heightened up, they can't listen to what you're telling them. And so that's why he said they prefer ignorance of what causes the torment. And they don't want to know, what the right thing is, or that this is okay or that's okay. He says, but throughout the night, which was really powerless, and which came upon them from the recesses of the powerless Hades, they all slept the same sleep. What was that sleep? He says, and now were driven by monstrous specters. In their dreams, they were terrified by monstrous specters, and now were paralyzed by their soul's surrender. For sudden and unexpected fear overwhelmed them. In their sleep, sudden and unexpected fear would grip them, and they would not be able to sleep properly and get their rest and that sort of thing. And he said, whoever was there fell down, and thus was kept shut up in a prison not made of iron. For whether they were farmers or shepherds or workers or who toiled in the wilderness, they were seized and endured the inescapable fate. For with one chain of darkness they were all bound. He said this darkness was so encompassing, it went throughout the whole of Egypt. And these people could not see light. God shut it off. And so he goes on. Okay, I'm not trying not to get ahead of myself here. He goes on. He says, whether there came a whistling wind, or a melodious sound of birds in wide-spreading branches, or the rhythm of violently rushing water, or the harsh crash of rocks hurled down, or the unseen running of leaping animals, or the sound of the most savage roaring beasts, or the echo thrown back from the hollow of the mountains. It paralyzed them with terror. He says it didn't matter what it was. If you remember, later on, after the Israelites left, God told the Israelites to go into the promised land. He says, I have put fear of you on all those people who were in the promised land, who were in the land of Canaan. They were squatters. They weren't supposed to be there, essentially. And God put terror on them. That's exactly what happened here. Unreasoning terror. Every particular sound. He said even the wind whistling, birds chirping, water rushing. He said it didn't matter what it was. It was terrifying to these people. And this is what Egypt went through until Pharaoh finally decided to give it up. This is one of the 12 plagues. Okay, he says, for the whole world was illumined with brilliant light, and went about its work unhindered. Wow, that's one thing that caught my attention, because we've always assumed that God just put darkness on Egypt. That's kind of the way the Bible, kind of leads you to believe. But Solomon is saying here, he says, the whole world was illumined and went about its work unhindered. It's not that darkness was all over Egypt. All of Egypt was blind. They couldn't see. No amount of light would get in. And the entire country was blind. But he says here, the whole world was illumined with bright light and went about its work unhindered, while over those people alone heavy night was spread, an image of the darkness that was destined to receive them, but still heavier than darkness were they to themselves. He said the speculation that they brought up, the fear, the worry, because they couldn't see, they didn't know what was going on, they couldn't control anything anymore. Animals would be, if they got out and wandering around, and the Israelites could be wandering around, and he goes on and says that light shines on the Israelites. He says the difference is, in verse 18, chapter 18, verse 1, he says, but on your holy ones there was great light. On your holy ones there was great light. The Israelites weren't blind. They went about their business, and they walked among the Egyptians as normal, and it only affected the Egyptians. And so he says their enemies, or the Egyptians, heard their voices but did not see their forms, and counted them happy for not having suffered, and were thankful that your holy ones, though previously wronged, were doing them no injury. He says, so here the slaves were taking care of the Egyptians, and the Egyptians were so thankful that he says they were so thankful. The Israelites could have killed the Egyptians, could have slaughtered them, and there would be nothing the Egyptians could have done about it. But they didn't. And he says the Egyptians were very thankful that they were doing them no injury. And they begged their pardon for having been at variance with them. The Egyptians were begging the Israelites to forgive them for making them slaves when they shouldn't have. They came to Egypt in peace, and then eventually some Pharaoh decided, hey, we got a whole workforce of people here, and made them into slaves. But here, even though he says, for their enemies deserved to be deprived of light and imprisoned in darkness, those who had kept your children imprisoned. He said they deserved this darkness because they had imprisoned God's children. And he says, through whom the imperishable light of the law has been given to the world. The Israelites, yes. Oh, okay. And so he was going on and saying that the Israelites could have taken revenge against Israel Egypt at that time, but they didn't. They decided not to. Okay. And let's see, what time's it getting to be? Okay, let's go ahead and take a few minutes here. That brings us up to the death of the Egyptian firstborn. He says, when they had resolved to kill the infants of your holy ones, and one child had been abandoned and rescued. Okay? What's he talking about there? One of the pharaohs, and because had decided that the Israelites were getting too big. Now, this was before Moses was born. He says, and this is in Exodus 12, he says that Pharaoh resolved to kill all the boys. Why kill the boys? Well, because you got to have boys to hook up with girls to have children. And so one way to cause the population to decrease is every time a woman got pregnant, then he ordered the midwives to kill any baby boys. And the midwife that came to help Moses' mother didn't do it. They didn't kill him. And he says that's why, and he says, and one child had been abandoned and rescued. That's where his sister, older sister, his mom and his older sister put him in a basket and knew that the Pharaoh's daughter would bathe at this particular day, at this particular spot. She liked to come down in the river and take a bath. And so they literally floated that basket towards her. And she immediately fell in love with Moses and knew it was a Hebrew baby, but that's okay. And that's why Moses was raised in the palace. And so he goes on here. He says, when they had resolved to kill the infants of your holy ones, and one child had been abandoned and rescued, you in punishment took away a multitude of their children. And this was years later, when Moses was 80 years old, okay, and then it's 80 years later, he says because Egypt had decided to kill the infant baby boys of the Israelites, God punished the Egyptians by taking away their firstborn their firstborn males and their firstborn boys. And he says, you destroyed them all together in a mighty flood. And that night was made known beforehand to our ancestors, so that they might rejoice in sure knowledge of the oaths in which they trusted. So what happened is Moses told the people, he said, this is what God's telling me. On, I believe it's the 10th day of that month, he says, you will take a lamb that is perfect, you will sacrifice it, and you will take the blood of it, you will take a branch of hyssop, you will dip that in that blood, and you will put it on the doorpost and lintel of your home where you come in. And he says, then you will sit down, you will roast the rest of the lamb, and you will eat as a family. And he said, if your family's too small, then a couple of families can join together. And he says, but when I see the blood, he says, the death angel will come over Egypt, but when I see the blood, I will command him to pass over you. And that's where we get the feast of the Passover. The death angel went all through Egypt, killed all the firstborn boys, and but when he saw the blood on the doorpost and lintel of the Egyptian or of the Israelites' houses, he passed over that house, and that's where we get the Passover. Okay, all right. I think this is probably a good place to stop. We'll pick up here next week and go through. We're coming up on the end of wisdom. Probably have one, maybe two more. I would guess parts of this. This is part 11. Okay, so making a note here of where we stopped, and that way I know where to pick up next week. All right. Let's see. Any questions? No. Okay. All right. Very good. And if you do have questions going along, feel free to message me and let me know what you've got. If I know what it is, I will certainly get back to you. If I don't know, I'll tell you that too. But I appreciate everybody that has joined me, all the folks that are watching this in an archive. Thank you so much. Again, take a moment to share the video, share the Bible study, and I will see you again next week, if not sooner. Thank you. Have a good night. Bye-bye.